Welcome to the Explainer. So what if I told you there's a plan to fund massive tax cuts and hit 6% GDP growth, a number we haven't seen in the modern economy, by totally rewriting the rules of global trade? Well, today we're going to break down that exact framework, and we're using an insider's account to do it. All right, so let's jump right in. Our story starts with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick on Air Force One. Now picture this. He's been awake for something like 20 hours, deep in these crazy international negotiations, and he finally nods off on the couch. Next thing he knows, he's woken up by the president literally tossing a Tootsie Roll at him, saying that it's a funny little story, right? But it really sets the stage for a very, very different and much more direct way of looking at global economics. So this whole strategy, it all starts with the diagnosis of the problem. And as the administration sees it, the U.S. trade deficit isn't just some normal thing that happens in a global economy. No, they see it as a fundamental ripoff of America. Now, standard economics has a pretty simple answer for this. A trade deficit is supposed to weaken your currency, right? That makes foreign stuff more expensive, and eventually things balance out. But this framework says America just breaks that model. Why? Because the whole world is always demanding US dollars to buy American innovation. Everything from the light bulb to the latest and greatest GPU. So the dollar stays strong. And what do other countries do with all those dollars they're raking in? Well, they turn around and use them to buy up American assets. And to really hammer this point home, Lutnick uses this great little analogy. Just imagine two islands. You've got Inventor Island. They're amazing at coming up with new ideas, but they let Producer Island actually make all the stuff. So Inventor Island keeps paying Producer Island for all these finished goods. And after a while, Producer Island has so much money, they just start buying up Inventor Island. Before you know it, the inventor is actually working for the producer. And you know what? That analogy isn't just some made-up story. It has played out in the real world on a massive scale. Think about this. As recently as 1985, America owned more of the world than the world owned of America. Fast forward to 2024, and it's completely flipped. We are now at a negative $26 trillion. That number right there is the entire reason for the strategy we're about to unpack. Okay, so how in the world do you even begin to tackle a $26 trillion problem? Well, the main tool they talk about is using tariffs, but in a really aggressive way. Not just as a tax, but as a negotiating weapon, a hammer to force completely new kinds of deals. So they had a choice to make. They could go with a simple universal tariff, one flat rate for every country. Or they could do something way more complex and go country by country. They ended up choosing the second path, the harder one, because they believed that by tailoring the threat to each specific nation, they could get the maximum leverage to completely reshape those individual trade relationships. In Lutnick's role in all of this, he puts it very, very clearly. He says that in these negotiations, while other people were leading the discussion, his job was to be the credible threat lurking in the background. He was the consequence, he was the tariff hammer, if a deal couldn't get done. Okay, so that's the theory, right? That's the big idea. Now let's get into how this hammer strategy actually works in practice. The source material lays out several huge deals that really show you the approach in action. All right, first up, Japan. The administration looked at Japan's car market and saw it as totally closed off, both culturally and economically. 94% of the cars driven in Japan are Japanese brands. So the initial threat was pretty straightforward, a 25% tariff on every single Japanese car coming into the US. Now, a 25% tariff would have been absolutely devastating to Japan's most important industry. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of just paying the tax, the negotiations led to something completely different. Japan agreed to create a $550 billion fund to build infrastructure. We're talking power plants, bridges, high-speed rail, all of it inside the United States. And the structure of this deal is just wild. Here's how it works. Japan funds the projects. In the beginning, the profits are split 50-50 until Japan gets its initial investment back, plus some interest. But after that, the U.S. Treasury gets 90% of all future profits from these long-term assets. This creates a massive, ongoing new revenue stream for the U.S. So here's the kicker. The crucial point here is that Japan's return on investment, it wasn't profit. Their dividend, as Lutnick calls it, was just avoiding that crippling 25% tariff. That was the price, getting to keep selling cars to the U.S. on better terms. Okay, so they took that same hammer strategy and applied it to pharmaceuticals. And the target here was this huge price difference you see. Americans were paying way, way more for the exact same drugs than the rest of the developed world. In effect, American consumers were subsidizing the research and development for everybody. The demand they made was for something called most favored nations pricing. And it's a really simple but really powerful idea. Drug companies would be flat out prohibited from selling their products to any other developed country for less than they charge in the US. Basically, America gets the best price in the world or nobody does. And the threat to make them comply, you guessed it, massive tariffs on any drugs made overseas. And this approach didn't stop there. It went into high tech too. Take this deal with Nvidia. The US agreed to grant export licenses so they could sell certain advanced AI chips to China. But in exchange, the US government gets a 25% revenue share on the value of those sales. So they turned an export control issue into yet another source of revenue. So, after all this, what's the endgame? What's the whole point? Well, the final piece of this explainer connects all this international deal-making right back to the domestic economy here at home. According to the source material, the hundreds of billions and maybe even trillions in new revenue from these tariffs and deals is meant to directly fund some really significant tax cuts for working Americans, starting from the bottom up. So the end result of all this activity, we're talking new factories, new infrastructure, new investment, is a projected GDP growth of 5% by 2026. Now, just to put that into perspective for you, US growth has rarely even broken 3% in the last 20 years. But the plan doesn't even stop there. The source claims that with a change in monetary policy, we're talking about the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates, that growth could hit a truly staggering 6%. I mean, that is a level of economic expansion the US hasn't seen in nearly 40 years. Now, the argument here is that this kind of growth won't be inflationary. Instead, it'll be driven by a real boom in productivity and the creation of high-paying jobs for technicians, pipe fitters, electricians, the very people you need to actually build all these new factories and power plants. So when you step back and look at the whole thing, what we've just walked through is a complete rethinking of America's economic place in the world. It's a fundamental shift from being just another player in global trade to being an aggressive architect of it, using economic muscle to reshape deals for direct domestic benefit. And the question this whole blueprint leaves us with is a really big one. Is this aggressive, transactional approach the future of the American economy? Or is it a massive gamble that could seriously backfire on the world stage?